Valerie from the Wedding Social. Thank you for taking the time on a Wednesday evening to join us on this music series presented by the Wedding Social in collaboration with a series of Hong Kong music groups. So for this event, we're very delighted to have Hong Kong Bach Choir hosting this music series, a pre-concert series on Mendelssohn's Lobgesang concert, which will happen on the May 10th. Yes. So today we're very happy to have Jerry, the music director of Hong Kong Bach Choir, to give us a little sharing and also talk on the Spanish poetry with a few composers and how the poetry and also music intertwine in the history of making. So without further ado, I will let Jerry do the talking, and in the meantime, please enjoy the wine provided so kindly by Pinewood Wine. And thank you, April, the president of Hong Kong Bach Choir, for inviting us to be a part of this meaningful program. Thank you and enjoy the evening.
Can you hear me?
Thanks, Valerie.
And thanks, April, for setting this up, and thank you all for being here. This is the second of two talks. I'm not going to repeat everything from last week. There are a few of you who were here then. But I will kind of get things going by reminding myself and you of some of what I spoke about last time, which was focused on Felix Mendelssohn's Symphony No. 2, also known as Lobgesang. Lobgesang, which means hymn of praise or song of praise. That was his title. The Symphony No. 2 came later, actually not from Mendelssohn himself, but from his publisher after Mendelssohn's death. He never published the piece, and this was the last, even though it's called Symphony No. 2, it's actually the last of his symphonies that he at least started, although not the last that he finished or that he left in a permanent state. So if you recall, the work was commissioned by the city of Leipzig in Germany for the celebration of the 400th anniversary of Johannes Gutenberg's invention of movable type, which made possible mass communication for the first time in history. Now, of course, that invention was, in general, an extremely positive thing. I mean, it's hard to imagine what the world would be like without the reach of printing and of communication that it led to. But at the same time, I mean, printing made possible really the Renaissance and the Enlightenment a bit later. But of course, with every positive development, there are often costs. And if it's possible to spread knowledge through mass communication, it's also possible to spread what now gets called fake news, lies, rumors, which allow various kinds of tyranny to develop. So even if the Renaissance and Enlightenment were made possible by mass communication, so was fascism, Nazism, and so on. So we spoke about that some. But mainly I was focused on the music of Mendelssohn himself. And in looking at this piece and the way Mendelssohn developed it, how he built this music, it's very similar to what Brahms did, Johannes Brahms did a generation later. And Brahms is kind of a foundation of the modern study of musical theory, musical analysis classes that music students either are forced to take or run to grab, depending on our outlook, are really built around the music of Brahms. Even though a lot of what Brahms did, Mendelssohn himself did a generation earlier, and Brahms learned from Mendelssohn. So the question is, why Brahms and why not Mendelssohn? Why did Arnold Schoenberg write a famous article called Brahms the Progressive instead of Mendelssohn the Progressive? And one of the ideas I suggested was that anti-Semitism had a great deal to do with this. Mendelssohn was descended from a Jewish, just very distinguished Jewish family, even though he himself was brought up Lutheran and was a devoted Christian his entire life. So that was one idea, and that was especially pushed by Richard Wagner. And the fact that we still inherit those attitudes today, not the anti-Semitic attitudes, but the idea of Mendelssohn as a lightweight and Brahms as a heavyweight, comes still from Wagner, even if overtly his ideas have been discarded, rejected. But there's another reason also that I think, and this I didn't mention, and this is launching us into today. I suspect that another reason why Mendelssohn tends to be disparaged critically, despite his great popularity, is that Mendelssohn was a rich kid. Mendelssohn's father was a wealthy banker in Berlin. And especially throughout the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century and later, the fantasy of people being born poor and pulling themselves up took root in a big way. Wagner was born poor, Brahms was born poor, and they got to where they got strictly through their own talent and initiative and hard work. And so the fact that Mendelssohn, in growing up, had every advantage. I mean, he had private tutors, and his family could have an orchestra, could hire an orchestra to play his compositions when he was a kid in their house, and he was able to go on a grand tour throughout Europe, which fed his imagination. That, in a sense, costs him in terms of how he's regarded. And again, that's something that if, as soon as I say it out loud, we say to ourselves, no, it's not like that. But these ideas take root kind of subliminally. And that reminds us, now here's where I get into the material for tonight, that the idea of class struggle, it's kind of appropriate that we're talking about this on the eve of May Day. Class struggle, as a concept, of course, is a product of the later 19th century and really became central in the early 20th century, at the same time that different strains of music were developing, very often in association with different political and social viewpoints. And that's where things really begin to get interesting for me in the music that we're playing, starting with Mendelssohn and also especially Dallapiccola, not so much Rautavaara. The early 20th century had various intensely competing movements in the fine arts and in music. For example, Futurism. Now, Futurism was an artistic movement that basically took root around the time of the First World War and soon afterwards. So at a time when the Soviet Union was established, but also at the time when fascism took root in Italy, when Mussolini took power, which is within a few years of each other. Futurism in the fine arts began in Italy and it essentially came out of Italy, although it spread. And the idea of Futurism was all the industrialization that had happened needed to find its way into art. So art somehow was associated with machines and skyscrapers and things like that. Futurism in art, in fine arts, was connected in a large way with fascism in Italy. So a lot of the futurist artists were big supporters of Mussolini. But there was also futurism in music. The same kind of idea of putting industrial sounds into music. The interesting thing about this, the paradoxical thing, is that this occurred mainly in the early Soviet Union, in the 20s, before Stalin really consolidated his power. And I want to begin by playing a bit of maybe the most famous futurist piece that came out of that era from about 1928. It was a part of a ballet by a composer who's not really well known anymore, whose last name was Mosolov. And the piece, this piece, which is only about 3.5 minutes long, is called The Iron Foundry. So it's an actual portrait in music of industrial sounds. Let's hear a bit of this. So the sound's a bit low, but I think we get the idea. And you might find this a little bit oppressive in its repetitiveness and the heaviness and just this constant, unchanging kind of motion which builds. But actually it was intended as a kind of championing of industrialization. So that's one kind of modernism that grew up in the early 20th century, but that really didn't have a chance to flourish because very soon, once the 30s began, it was repressed in the Soviet Union, in favor of music that Stalin preferred, which became known as socialist realism. And this was true not only in music, but in other forms of art also. Music that somehow championed the common man, but that also looked to attract the common man and woman as audiences. We mustn't forget that classical music has always been an elitist entertainment. It was something that really was not available to, wasn't open to working class people. So one of the goals of socialist realism was to make music accessible to common people, people who were not educated in the arts and in music, by giving them something that was based in something familiar. And this was not only true in the Soviet Union, but also in places where many artists, especially during the Great Depression, shared their, some of that viewpoint. For example, in the United States, where Aaron Copland took over many of those types of ways of thinking about how to connect artistically with the masses of people. Now, what's interesting to me about this, because we'll get soon into the real modernism that people think about when they think about modernist music, mainly people like Schoenberg and Stravinsky. What's interesting is the kind of unexpected political connections that people involved in these musical strains were also involved with. So we have, as I said, the futurists in art who were kind of on the right wing, or to you it's on that side, I guess. I should go backwards. So the right wing. Socialist realism was music of the left wing when it was in the Soviet Union, but similar kind of music was in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, associated with the right wing. And composers who rejected those attitudes and looked to new ways of creating music, creating a new kind of modern music, were also in both camps. For example, Igor Stravinsky, who we think of as a modernist who represented a rejection of the old ways of doing things, was himself politically, we might say, reactionary. He was really a monarchist at heart, as was Arnold Schoenberg. On the other hand, Schoenberg's associate, his pupil and associate, Anton Webern, who's really the destination of this train of my thought, was a man of the left. He conducted a workers' orchestra in Vienna. But he was very naive, and he actually supported Hitler, not understanding that as soon as Hitler took over Austria, Webern would lose all his jobs and lose all opportunities for performance. So the political winding road went kind of in parallel to the artistic winding road, sometimes intersecting and sometimes diverging. And the music on the first half of our program that we're talking about, Dallapiccola, and also in a sense, Rautavaara, both inhabit those worlds. So I'll begin by talking about Dallapiccola, who was born in 1904 and died in 1975. So he grew up in Mussolini's Italy. Now, Dallapiccola was absolutely one of my favorite composers. What's really wonderful about him is that he found a way to blend, to marry the innovations of modernist music, especially that of Anton Webern, to the traditional Italian lyricism that we associate with composers like Puccini, who, by the way, was also an early supporter of Mussolini. And that seems like an impossible task. I mean, Webern wrote music that was aphoristic, that is, where a composer like Schubert or Mozart will write a big tune, Webern will write 2 notes. And it's the way he connects these and the colors he gives them that provide a sort of equivalence. But it doesn't sound to us like that. And he wasn't interested really in what we consider to be melody. But Dallapiccola, as we'll see very soon, took these same constructive methods and produced something that where we can hear the relationship to Weber, but in a sense we can also hear the relationship to Puccini. Now, Dallapiccola was very much a man of the left, which made him really in danger of his life during the Second World War, and he had to go underground. He's probably best known for a trilogy of compositions he wrote that are either you can think of as anti-fascist or pro-socialist. One is called Canti di Prigionia, Songs of Imprisonment. Another one is called Canti di Liberazione, Songs of Liberation, from a little bit later, from the 50s. And the best known one is a short one-act opera, one of the great operas of the 20th century, called Il Prigioniero, The Prisoner, which takes place during the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, but is really connected with the experiences that Dallapiccola had undergone during the Mussolini era. Now, the piece that we're playing really has no direct political connections like those. It's a kind of tone painting, an illustration through music of a poem. The poem is by one of the great Spanish poets of the 20th century, Antonio Machado. Now, Machado was a little bit older. He was born in 1875. So he was a member of a group of poets and writers and philosophers called the generation of 98, of 1898. People who had kind of come to artistic maturity in the wake of Spain's catastrophic experience in what Americans know as the Spanish-American War, in which Spain lost Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines, among others, to the United States. So kind of all of Spain's illusions about its own strength were shattered. And this group of poets looked for a new way, a way of renewal of Spanish culture. One of the ways that some did, including Machado, was looking towards leftist politics. He wasn't really a politician, but it was known that he supported, for example, the Republican side, the Popular Front government that overthrew the monarchy in Spain in the 1930s, the leftist side in the Spanish Civil War. Machado suffered during that war. He had to be removed from one place to another, from Madrid to Barcelona, or I forget the sequence, to Seville, to other places, eventually escaping across the border to France, where he died basically of grief and exhaustion within weeks of Franco's final victory. So he was a victim of the Spanish Civil War. He was a victim of repression, and he was a victim of these forces, the negative forces that come from the wonderful invention, as a byproduct of the wonderful invention that Mendelssohn's Symphony celebrates. As I was saying that Machado died of exhaustion and grief, I suddenly realized that, of course, Mendelssohn also died of exhaustion and grief. Even though, you know, Mendelssohn was a rich kid who had an easy life in some ways, he basically died of overwork. He was a extremely self-critical and intensely hard, overworking man, and the grief came from the death of his beloved sister. He died just a few months later. So there's a connection there that I hadn't even realized. Anyway, rather than talk more about Webern, about modernist music and Dallapiccola, I'd like you to listen to a little bit. First, we have a clip, the very beginning of Anton Webern's Symphony, his Symphony Opus 21, which interestingly was written the same year as the Mosolov Iron Foundry that we listened to a few minutes ago. It's a symphony because, well, it's in two movements, and it has some elements of what we recognize, what I recognize, maybe you not so much, as symphonic form. For example, there are repeats, sectional repeats in the first movement, but the whole symphony lasts about 9 minutes, and it's only, I think, for 13 instruments. It's a while since I conducted it, I forget all the details. So we'll listen first to a bit of that, the opening section. Notice that the rhythm basically is very steady. We have the same rhythmic patterns, but the notes, the pitches, constantly change, and the instruments that Webern assigns them to also constantly change, so that we don't have a sense of continuity as much as we have a sense of each moment in isolation, kind of spotlit as a different color. Oh, and you can follow in the score. that's just a taste of that kind of music. It's music that doesn't have a huge audience, but those of us who love it really love it. Now let's listen to a bit of Dallapiccola's, the opening of Piccola Musica Notturna. But before we listen to it, and we have the score there also, I want to read you the poem by Machado that it in effect sets. It's a poem called Summer Night. I won't read the Spanish, I'll just read my translation. It is a beautiful summer night. The tall houses have their balconies open onto the wide square of the ancient village. In the broad, deserted rectangle, stone benches, euonymus shrubs, and symmetrical acacia trees cast their black shadows on the white sand. At its zenith, the moon, and on the tower, the face of the illuminated clock. In this ancient village, I pass alone, like a phantom. So we have here an image of at night, a night scene of a deserted village square that's inhabited during the day, but empty at night, and from the point of view of a single person who may or may not be lonely, but is certainly alone and feeling that aloneness intensely. What I find wonderful about this piece, one of the many things I find wonderful about this piece, is the way Dallapiccola, this Italian from Florence, from northern Italy, is able to evoke the sense of the hot, still, southern Spanish night. That's enough, but can we go back to the beginning and just put it on pause, right, the first pages, because I want to point out a couple of things. So, without playing it, just, this is also, like the Weber, it's about the same length. The piece takes about 7 to 8 minutes to play, so it's very short. And the Weber is called a symphony. This is not called a symphony, but it's at least, if not more, as symphonic as or maybe I should use this. Maybe then I don't have to raise my voice. It's at least as symphonic as the Weber, if not more. So symphonies' first movements tend to have usually two themes, two subjects that are somehow put in contrast to each other, in opposition to each other. And this one does too. What we heard at the beginning here in the violas is a first theme. And then this kind of interruption marks its ending. And then in the clarinet, we have a second theme. There, that. A falling figure, whereas this one kind of undulates. They're actually based on the same material. there's also a closing theme. I stopped before we quite got to it. So, in the same way as Webern did, Dallapiccola recreates the same structures, the age-old structures of classical music. The difference is that in Webern it's so transformed that we don't recognize it as such. But even these little bits, I hope you recognize these as actual melodies. And Dallapiccola brings them back, plays with them in the same way that a Mozart or a Beethoven would develop his themes in a symphony. In my score, I've marked, exposition, development, recapitulation the same way I would with Beethoven. And I hope maybe it'll be a little bit clearer next week when we play it, because I actually play this just a little bit faster than this performance, which I think makes everything cohere a little bit better. So that's Dallapiccola. Dallapiccola was also very much influenced by Bach, although we don't hear it so much in this piece. So all of these things come together, and I'd be curious after the concert next week, for those of you who were there, to know whether you do feel this kind of marriage, as I called it, between modernism and Italian lyricism. Now, that brings us to the second piece on the program by the Finnish composer Eino Juhani Rautavaara, who was born in 1928 and died just a few years ago, 2016. So he's a generation younger than Dallapiccola. Dallapiccola was kind of a late bloomer, so most of his music is post-war. Most of his well-known music is, post-war, late 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. Rautavaara had a very long career, wrote 8 symphonies, a whole bunch of operas, 15 concertos. His best-known piece is a concerto for birds and orchestra using recorded bird song. It's called Cantus Arcticus, Arctic song. This piece that we're going to play, called Balada, ballad, is one of his last big pieces, 2014, 2015, something like that. Rautavaara had a fascination with the poetry of another great Spanish poet, Federico Garcia Lorca. Garcia Lorca is, much better known than Machado, I guess, and also prized by quite a few composers. In the United States, there was a composer who died just a year or two ago named George Crumb, who set, I don't know how many poems and groups of poems by Garcia Lorca. Rautavaara wrote 2 large sets of unaccompanied choral pieces setting poetry by Garcia Lorca. And towards the end of his life, he planned an opera about Lorca that would use Garcia Lorca's poetry as its text. The opera never was completed. He never had an opportunity to finish it, or maybe he just found problems that were insurmountable. Like many composers, though, he had sketched a lot of music for it, and not one to waste what he had prepared, he reorganized much of the music that he had prepared into a piece for choir and orchestra that is Balada. So all of the poetry is by Garcia Lorca, although Rautavaara himself made selections. I was reading through some of it today. He didn't even use necessarily complete poems. He used one stanza from this poem, another from another. So he's in effect co-writing the libretto with Garcia Lorca. Now, how does this fit into our program? Well, Garcia Lorca is maybe the most famous victim of the Spanish Civil War. If Machado died in exile in 1939, exhausted from having escaped, Garcia Lorca was assassinated in the first weeks of the war. He was well known as a socialist and a supporter of the Republican cause, even though he wasn't especially a political actor. But what was especially criminal in the eyes of the fascists was the fact that he was gay. So he was dragged out of his house and taken and shot. So again, his poetry is not political in the same way that Machado's is not political. So for us, there's just this awareness in the back of our minds as we listen to the music that, again, the cost of technological innovation can be steep. Rautavaara's style, Rautavaara is probably the great Finnish composer after Sibelius. And it's possible to recognize kind of the inheritance, maybe a little bit deeper down, not quite on the surface. Like Dallapiccola, Rautavaara is a very lyrical composer, a kind of craggy lyricism. Dallapiccola is Mediterranean. There's the warm Mediterranean sun that permeates his music. Rautavaara is Finnish. It's the birch forests of the north. So we hear that also, but mixed with this evocation of the hot, still summer in southern Spain. So I'd like to finish by playing a couple of excerpts from Balada, which is a piece that takes about 17 or 18 minutes to play. Two short excerpts. I want to, again, read you the poems, or the bits of the text that are in these segments from different poems that give you an idea, if you've not read Garcia Lorca's poetry, of his kind of surrealist, symbolist imagery. He had various obsessions in his poetry that he keeps coming back to. Love, death, longing, the need to travel, the need to roam, and mixed with that, a lot of color symbolism. If you're a rock and roll fan, you might recall a song by the Rolling Stones, an early song by the Rolling Stones called Painted Black, which uses blackness as a symbol. That's very similar to the kind of thing that Garcia Lorca does. There's a whole section in this piece that focuses on the color green, for example, but not in these sections. The first section gives you an idea. I am going on a journey far away long before dawn. Poor and calm, I wish to visit the ecstatic world inhabited by my potential and by my lost landscapes. I wish to enter that world cold but sharp, seeking the love which I do not have, but which is mine. Finally, purely by chance, I found it. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror, and without my asking, its silver surface was filled with the song of nightingales, and from its depth arose the clear and precise key, the key that I am naturally forbidden to reveal. So that's the opening of the piece. We've got the sound about as high as we can get it. I wish it could be a bit louder, but you get a sense of it, I think. And one of the things I find wonderful about this is that Rautavaara uses some of the same techniques that Dallapiccola does to evoke this sense of stillness and heat, a kind of undulating line that goes throughout. It's moving a little bit more than Dallapiccola's, but a similar idea musical idea of how to bring that out. So the second bit is from, I guess you would say, the middle section of this piece, which is much more active, faster and more active. And again, I'll read this bit of text. Different poem. Death enters and exits the tavern. Black horses pass by and somber folk on the deep paths of the guitar. An odor of salt and of a female's blood rises from the feverish mat grass on the seashore. Death enters and exits the tavern. Death. hope that these little tidbits, these little tastes, make you want to consume more of this music next Saturday. To be able to present, to introduce people to explore music that I love is really, I mean, you can't match that kind of joy. And so you really, I mean, just by coming tonight and especially by coming next week, you are giving me the really the greatest gift that an artist can receive. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Coming, and I hope you've learned a lot in the past for this lecture and the previous lecture, that you learned more about the background of the music that we're going to perform next week, which is Saturday, May 10th, in the Hong Kong City Hall Concert Hall. So the concert title is Mendelssohn Lobgesang, and we're going to perform Mendelssohn's Lobgesang and the two pieces today, which is Dallapiccola's Piccola, Musica, Notturna, and Rautavaara's Balada. And lastly, I would like to invite Michael Cheung, who is our marketing manager as well as a wine professional from Pinewood Wine, who is the wine sponsor tonight. And he has something to say about the wine pairing and the repertoire tonight. So.
Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you for Hoberman's invitation for us to sponsor wine for tonight, because I'm in the choir, I sing in the choir, and I do marketing. And now I'm suddenly speaking from another perspective about the wine, so I feel really excited about it. And of course, thank you, Mendelssohn, for providing this wonderful space for us. I hope you all enjoyed the previous ones that you had. So today we actually had Prosecco, which is a single VR Prosecco called Riva di Santo Stefano. It's a very fine Prosecco, very different from the ones that you had, I hope, because I personally, I really feel it. And then the second one that you had, I'm so sorry, because on the program it says it serves red and then the white. The reasons behind that was actually because the white is actually slightly sweet. It's not really that sweet, but semi-sweet. So I prefer to serve it behind the red. But because we had a little bit of serving problem during the red wine, so I had to switch the order. I hope you don't mind, but it still worked in a way. So the second wine that you had was a Muscat from the Alsace region. And then the third wine that most of you are having right now is a Spanish red wine. It's a blend of 4 different grapes. I think some of you might think that it smells a little bit strange and funky. That's supposed to be it. It's nothing strange about the wine, because it's been aged in oak barrels for 16 months in new French oak barrels. So it has a very strong smell of new oak that some people might not be familiar with, like sweet spice, like vanilla, like a little bit of like dark chocolate. And then, because it's aged for so long, the vintage of the wine is 2012. So it's more than 10 years already. So it developed a lot of earthiness, a lot of like forest flow, as well as some kind of like meatiness in the wine. So it might trick you to feel that the wine, oh, is it off or something? Is it like it's gone bad or something? No, it's the development in the bottom, and it's meant to be. So about my wine pairing of the night with the repertoire. It's actually quite challenging to pair wine with music, because normally I pair wine with food. But when it comes to music, I think it's interesting to pair with wine, because different music, different composers, they all have different styles and different contexts in the music. And in wine, it's actually it's the same. We have different intensity. We have different types of grapes. So, for example, for this red wine, it was meant to be paired with the Balada. And the reason behind that is because I felt the complexity in the music. And for this wine, it has a very high complexity to me. So I feel that it might match well with it. And then for the first one that you had, which was the Rive Prosecco, the single vineyard Prosecco, when I heard the piece for the first time, I felt that it has a lot of intensity in it. Then I felt like, okay, first of all, I like all of you to have a sparkling to start with. That's why I chose something that's sparkling. And then I felt like, okay, a single vineyard Prosecco has a high intensity than normal Prosecco or like other sparkling wine. So I chose it. So I hope you feel that intensity is higher than average. If you want to taste some more Prosecco, I still have some here, so you can come find me afterwards. And then for the Muscat, for me, it's a semi-sweet. The reason that I put it after the red wine, I said it because it's a little bit sweet, and also because I want all of you to leave this room with a sweet palate, so that okay, I will have a sweet dream and you know, a nice evening for you. And of course, because I personally really like Mendelssohn. It's actually the very first classical music that I sang with a choir, like a huge choir, was Mendelssohn. So it gave me that kind of nostalgic, little bit of sweet memories. So I chose the Muscat for that. For those of you who were here last week, you also had something similar, but the last one, the semi-sweet wine, is quite different, I have to say, because the previous one, the Gewürztraminer, was so floral, so strong, so aromatic. For the Muscat, it's less aromatic, but it's also grapey and sweet in a way, so they have like different pairing opportunities. So do come here after I finish my talk and grab some food and try different pairings. So you can talk to me or ask me any questions about wine pairing or questions about the wines. We have a QR code on the form that you have, and also we have a QR code here on the table. The whole collection, we offered a really great discount to you. If you want to take away like 1 or 2 bottles, I do have like really literally 1 or 2 bottles here that for somebody to take away. Otherwise, if you order 6 bottles, it's free delivery for you. So thank you so much again for Hong Kong Bach Choir and also William Social for the opportunity. I hope you all enjoyed the wines tonight. Thank you so much. I'll have
Sure, thank you very much for coming tonight, and I hope you'll all be coming to our concert next Saturday. And I think now it's just time to break into a party and enjoy more wine and snacks, and that's it. Thank you for coming.